Sarah stared out the car window as they drove through the winding country roads, dense trees lining either side, their gnarled branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. The GPS signal had cut out miles ago, but Matt seemed confident he knew the way. He always did. For months they had talked about leaving the city, finding somewhere quiet to start fresh, but now that it was happening, Sarah felt a knot of unease twisting tighter in her stomach. With each mile, they traveled deeper into nowhere. "Almost there," Matt said, glancing over with a reassuring smile. "Just a few more minutes." Sarah forced a smile back, but her fingers drummed anxiously on her thigh. She didn't know why, but something about the move felt wrong. Maybe it was just nerves. Maybe it was the exhaustion of the last few months, the stress of selling their cramped apartment, leaving her job, and Matt's relentless optimism. The house was supposed to be a good thing, a fresh start, their escape from the noise, the crowds, the constant pressure of life in the city. But as they turned onto the overgrown driveway and the house came into view, her breath caught in her throat. The house stood tall and imposing, shrouded in shadows cast by the towering oaks that surrounded it. It was Victorian, just as the listing had shown, a grand old relic of a time long past. Its once white paint was now a sickly gray, peeling and weathered by decades of neglect. Tall windows lined the front, dark and empty, staring down at them like eyes. A steep roof, its shingles cracked and faded, jutted sharply upward, and at the top was a spire that seemed to pierce the sky. The whole structure leaned slightly to one side, as if bowing under the weight of its own history. Sarah had fallen in love with the idea of it when they'd first seen the pictures online. The charm, the history, it had felt like a dream. But standing in its shadow now, she couldn't help but feel small and vulnerable, as if the house was a giant ready to swallow them whole. "God, it's even better in person, isn't it?" Matt said, practically beaming as he parked the car. He jumped out, stretching his arms and taking in the view. "Better," Sarah muttered under her breath, her gaze fixed on the sagging front porch. She couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching them, waiting for something. "Come on, you're going to love it," Matt called from the front steps, already fishing the keys out of his pocket. "Wait until you see the inside." With a deep breath, Sarah followed him, her feet crunching over the gravel drive. She hesitated at the front door, running her hand along the weathered wood. It felt colder than it should have. Inside, the air was thick and musty, the kind of smell that comes from years of abandonment. The wooden floors creaked beneath their feet as they stepped into the foyer, the high ceilings and dark wood paneling giving the house an oppressive feel. Dust hung in the air like fine powder, stirred by their movement. "It just needs a little cleaning up," Matt said, oblivious to the way Sarah's shoulders tensed with each step. "A few coats of paint, some new furniture. We'll have it looking brand new in no time." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the house didn't want to be made new. It wanted to stay exactly as it was, old, forgotten, untouched. She wandered through the rooms, each one darker and colder than the last. The windows let in only slivers of light through heavy, half-closed drapes. The wallpaper, once bright and floral, was now peeling and faded, revealing patches of cracked plaster beneath. There was something oppressive about the silence that filled the space. It was too quiet, as though the house were holding its breath, listening to them. "Sarah!" She jumped, turning to find Matt standing at the base of the stairs. "I'll check out the upstairs. You want to start down here?" Nodding, she let him go, the sound of his footsteps disappearing as he ascended. Alone now, Sarah walked toward the back of the house, drawn to the kitchen. The smell of damp wood and decay grew stronger as she approached. She paused at the threshold, something tugging at the edge of her awareness. A feeling, like someone was behind her. She turned quickly, but there was nothing, just the empty hallway stretching into shadows. Her heart raced, and she shook her head, forcing a laugh. "It's just the house," she told herself. "Just an old, creaky house." But the feeling wouldn't leave her. Even as she stepped into the kitchen and opened the curtains, letting light flood the room, the sense of being watched lingered. Her eyes scanned the corners of the ceiling, the dark spaces where the light didn't reach. A sudden creak from above made her freeze. She looked up. The sound had come from the attic. Matt had told her the house came with an attic, though they hadn't explored it yet. The realtor had brushed it off, saying it was just a storage space. But as Sarah stood there, staring at the ceiling, she felt the prickle of cold dread wash over her. The air seemed to shift colder now, and she thought she heard something, a faint, almost imperceptible scratching like nails on wood. "Matt!" she called out, but her voice was swallowed by the silence. She moved slowly back into the hallway, her footsteps echoing louder than they should have. The attic door was just above her, a small square panel in the ceiling with a thin cord dangling down. She hadn't noticed it before. The scratching grew louder. "Matt?" she called again, her voice more urgent this time. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. The attic creaked again, and for a brief moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw the panel shift ever so slightly. Her heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her gaze locked on the attic door, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But nothing did. When Matt returned, his cheerful voice cutting through her panic, she nearly jumped out of her skin. "This place is incredible," he exclaimed. "Wait until you see the view from the master bedroom." Sarah forced a smile, but her eyes kept flicking to the ceiling, to the place where the faint sounds had come from. She said nothing to Matt about the noises, about the scratching. She didn't want to sound ridiculous, but as they explored the rest of the house, the feeling of being watched never left her. That night, as they settled into bed in the cavernous, dimly lit master bedroom, Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. The house was too quiet, the darkness too thick. And then she heard it again. A creak, a slow, deliberate sound, like footsteps, coming from the attic. The attic door loomed above them, a square of darkness in the hallway ceiling. Sarah stood beneath it, staring at the thin cord hanging down, feeling a deep unease settle in her stomach. Matt, however, seemed more curious than cautious, holding the flashlight with an eager grin on his face. "I bet it's just full of old junk," Matt said as he pulled the cord. The hatch creaked open with a groan, releasing a cloud of dust into the air. A wooden ladder unfolded slowly, its joints protesting from decades of disuse. The smell of stale air and decay washed over them. Sarah wrinkled her nose, taking a step back. It was as if the attic had been sealed off for years, untouched by time, forgotten. Matt climbed first, his feet clomping on the rickety ladder. "Come on," he called down, his voice muffled. "It's just a bunch of old stuff. Probably antiques." Sarah hesitated, staring up into the black hole above. Her instincts screamed at her not to follow, to leave it alone, to pretend that nothing was wrong. But Matt's head popped back into view, his face split in a grin, his hand reaching down for her. "We came all this way. You've got to see this." Swallowing her fear, Sarah grabbed his hand and hoisted herself up. The attic was cold, much colder than the rest of the house. A thick layer of dust coated everything, old furniture, trunks, forgotten lamps, and rotting boxes. The faint light from the window barely cut through the gloom, casting long shadows that twisted and bent in strange ways as their flashlights flickered over the clutter. Sarah shivered, her breath visible in the cold attic air. Something about the space felt wrong. It was as if the room itself were holding its breath, waiting. Matt was already rummaging through an old trunk, the sound of his digging breaking the oppressive silence. Sarah wandered further, her flashlight catching on an old mirror leaning against the wall. The glass was cracked, its reflection distorted, but something about it drew her closer. She wiped away the dust, revealing a warped image of herself staring back, pale, ghostly, and small beneath the towering shadows. A creak from behind her snapped her attention away from the mirror. She spun around, the beam of her flashlight sweeping across the attic, but nothing was there. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice tight with unease. Matt paused, glancing up from the pile of ancient books he'd discovered. "Hear what?" There was a sound, like something moved. Matt chuckled, shaking his head. "It's probably just the wind, or the house settling. Old places like this are full of noises." But it hadn't sounded like the house settling. It had sounded like footsteps, like something or someone had been walking just behind her. As her flashlight moved across the floor, Sarah noticed something strange. Deep, dark scuff marks in the dust, as if heavy objects had been dragged across the wood recently. Her heart skipped a beat. "Matt, look at this," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She knelt, tracing the marks with her fingers. They led toward the far corner of the attic, to a space where the light barely reached. "Probably from moving stuff up here years ago," Matt said dismissively, but his curiosity piqued as Sarah moved closer to the shadows. That's when she saw it, a door. Small, barely noticeable behind a stack of decaying boxes. It was so hidden that Sarah wouldn't have noticed it if not for the scratches on the floor leading straight to it. Her pulse quickened. "Matt, there's another door back here." Matt was beside her in seconds, shining his flashlight over the small wooden door. "Weird," he muttered. "Did the realtor mention anything about this?" Sarah shook her head, her eyes fixed on the door. It looked old, ancient even, its wood warped and splintering. There was no handle, just a simple latch. It didn't look like it had been opened in years, but the scratches on the floor told a different story. Matt reached for the latch, but Sarah grabbed his wrist, stopping him. "Wait," she whispered, her voice tight with dread. Matt turned to her, his expression softening. "It's just an old storage space, Sarah. Probably nothing. You're just spooking yourself." But she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible waited behind that door, something they weren't meant to find. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to leave the attic, to close the hatch and never return. But Matt's hand was already on the latch, and before she could stop him, the door creaked open. A gust of cold air rushed out, colder than the attic itself, smelling of damp earth and something far worse, something rotten. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as Matt aimed his flashlight into the space beyond. The beam illuminated a narrow passageway, lined with rotting wood and decaying walls, leading deeper into the attic, disappearing into darkness. For a moment, they both stood frozen, staring into the passage. It was as if the darkness within were alive, breathing, watching them. "This is insane," Sarah muttered, taking a step back. "Let's just close it up. Forget about it." But Matt was already moving forward, curiosity driving him deeper into the hidden corridor. Sarah watched him go, every muscle in her body screaming for her to stop him. But she stayed rooted to the spot, her breath shallow and quick. "Matt," she called, her voice trembling. "Please don't go any further." But he didn't respond. He had already disappeared into the darkness. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Sarah's flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. She strained her ears, waiting for Matt to say something, anything. And then she heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. But they weren't Matt's. They were lighter, more measured, coming from somewhere deeper in the passage. Sarah's blood ran cold. She took a step back, her hands trembling. "Matt!" she called again, louder this time. Still, no answer. Suddenly, her flashlight went out, plunging her into darkness. Panic surged through her as she fumbled with the switch, her breath coming in shallow gasps. When the light flickered back to life, she froze. There, at the far end of the attic, just beyond the open door, stood a figure. A woman. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The woman was pale, almost translucent, her long dark hair hanging in limp strands over her face. She stood perfectly still, staring at Sarah from the shadows. Her clothes were tattered, hanging loosely on her thin frame, and her hands were twisted, claw-like at her sides. Sarah's mouth went dry, her body frozen in place as the woman slowly tilted her head, her eyes dark, hollow, and empty, locking onto Sarah's. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. The air between them seemed to thicken, as if the very space in the attic had shifted, bending under the weight of the woman's presence. And then the woman stepped forward. Sarah screamed, her voice piercing the silence of the attic. She turned and ran, stumbling down the ladder, nearly losing her footing as she hit the floor below. The attic hatch slammed shut behind her, but she didn't dare look back. Her heart thundered in her chest as she stood in the hallway, trembling, trying to make sense of what she had just seen. But the only thing that filled her mind was the woman's face, her hollow eyes, and that terrible, crooked smile. Sarah lay in bed that night, wide awake, the echo of her scream still ringing in her ears. She kept replaying what had happened in the attic over and over again, trying to convince herself that it wasn't real, that her mind was playing tricks on her, that it had been a shadow or the dust making shapes in the gloom. But no matter how hard she tried, the image of the woman's gaunt, pale face refused to leave her mind, that terrible, twisted smile. Matt had returned from the attic minutes after her frantic escape, confused and skeptical, brushing off her panic as some sort of hallucination brought on by stress. "You're just tired," he'd said, sitting beside her on the bed, his hand resting on her trembling shoulder. "It's an old house, Sarah. Shadows can play tricks on you. Trust me, there's nothing up there." But she didn't believe him. She had seen the woman. She had felt her presence, an oppressive, suffocating cold that clung to her skin, that watched her, waiting. The sensation of being watched had followed her out of the attic and into every corner of the house. No matter where she went, no matter how brightly lit the room, she felt it. The eyes, always on her, lurking just beyond her sight. That night, as Matt slept soundly beside her, Sarah stared at the ceiling, her pulse quickening every time the house creaked or groaned. Her eyes kept drifting to the attic hatch in the hallway. It loomed there, like a wound in the ceiling, a constant reminder of what she had seen, or thought she had seen. She kept expecting it to open, to hear those soft, deliberate footsteps, to see the woman's shadow in the doorway again. But the night dragged on in an unbearable silence, broken only by the slow, rhythmic sound of Matt's breathing. She didn't sleep. The next morning, Sarah stood at the kitchen sink, washing the few dishes they'd used for breakfast. The sun filtered in through the dusty window, casting pale, weak light across the countertops, but it did nothing to ease the gnawing tension in her chest. Every few seconds, she found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, lurking in the corners. She hadn't gone back up to the attic, and Matt had stopped pushing her to. He probably thought she was overreacting. Maybe he was right. Maybe it had all been a trick of the light, her nerves getting the better of her. But then she saw it. the reflection in the window. At first, she thought it was a smudge on the glass, a trick of the sunlight, but as she looked closer, her blood turned to ice. There, just behind her in the reflection, was a figure, a shadow, tall, thin, and indistinct, hovering at the edge of the kitchen, just barely visible, as if it were watching her from a distance. Sarah whipped around, her heart slamming into her ribs. There was nothing there. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the empty kitchen. Her hands trembled as she backed away from the sink, the sound of dripping water fading into the background. She was alone. There was no one else in the house except Matt, who was outside tending to some overgrown bushes by the porch. Yet she had seen it. In the reflection, just for a second, a dark, looming shape standing still, watching her. She turned back to the window and stared at her own pale, shaken reflection. Nothing. It was gone. Sarah forced herself to breathe, to calm down, but the air felt heavy, thick. Every inch of her body was tense, every nerve on edge, waiting for something to move, for the reflection to change again. "It's all in your head," she told herself. "You didn't see anything. There's no one here. You're just tired." But she didn't believe it. The days passed in a blur of mounting fear. The house, once so full of promise, now felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air growing colder, heavier. Every corner of the house felt wrong, like it was watching her. And then there were the dreams. They started small, creeping into her sleep like whispers in the dark. The first few nights, they were nothing more than flashes of images, dark figures, cold hands reaching out from the shadows. But soon, the dreams grew more vivid, more intense. In every dream, the woman was there. Sarah would find herself standing in the attic, the cold seeping into her bones, the air thick with dust. The woman would be in the corner, her twisted smile wide and unnatural, her hollow eyes fixed on Sarah. She wouldn't move, wouldn't speak, but her presence was enough to freeze Sarah in place, to trap her in the dream, and each time the woman would whisper the same thing. "Stay." Sarah would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, her skin clammy. She couldn't sleep anymore, couldn't escape the feeling that the woman was waiting for her, lurking just beyond the edge of her consciousness. It wasn't long before the paranoia took hold. Sarah began to avoid certain rooms in the house, the dark ones, the ones where the shadows stretched too far, where the corners seemed too deep. She couldn't explain it to Matt. He wouldn't understand. He'd tell her it was all in her head, that she was letting her imagination get the best of her. But it wasn't just her imagination. It was real. She could feel it. The whispers started next. At first, they were faint, barely audible, a low murmur in the back of her mind, like the wind rustling through the trees. But they grew louder, more insistent, until she couldn't ignore them anymore. The whispers followed her everywhere, in the bathroom, in the hallway, even in the yard when she tried to escape the house for fresh air. They were there, just out of reach, too quiet to understand, but too persistent to ignore. And the worst part was, they always seemed to be calling her name. "Sarah," the voice whispered, soft and cold, like a breath against her skin. "Sarah," she told Matt once, in a moment of desperation, but he only frowned and shook his head, his concern quickly turning to frustration. "Sarah, you've got to stop this," he said, his voice sharp. "You're letting this house get to you. There's no one whispering your name. You're not being watched. It's all in your head." But it wasn't just in her head. The voice was real, and it was getting louder. One night, after hours of lying awake, Sarah heard it again. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from above, from the attic. She lay perfectly still, her heart hammering in her chest as the steps moved across the ceiling, soft but unmistakable. The woman was up there. She could feel her, watching, waiting. Sarah's skin crawled, every nerve in her body screaming for her to get up, to leave, to run far away from the house. But something kept her there, rooted in place, listening. Then the attic hatch creaked. She bolted upright, her breath caught in her throat. The door was moving. Slowly, inch by inch, it began to open, the ladder creaking as it descended. Terror surged through her, but she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The woman was coming down. She was going to leave the attic, going to find her. And then, just as the hatch hung open in the dark hallway, Sarah saw it, a shadow at the edge of her vision, standing at the top of the ladder. The woman's twisted smile flashed in the darkness, and the cold, breathy whisper filled the room once more. "Stay with me." Sarah didn't scream this time. She couldn't. The fear was too deep, too consuming, wrapping around her like ice. She clutched the blankets tight, staring at the attic door, waiting for the woman to appear fully, to crawl down the ladder and reach for her. But the shadow never moved. It stayed there, hovering at the edge of the hatch, its presence thick and suffocating. By the time Matt woke, Sarah was already curled up in the corner of the bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, her eyes hollow and red-rimmed from the lack of sleep. She didn't tell him what she had seen. She didn't need to. She knew the woman wouldn't stay in the attic forever. Soon, she would come for Sarah. Sarah stood at the foot of the attic ladder, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The open hatch gaped above her, a black mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She wasn't sure how long she had been standing there, staring up into the dark, but she knew that tonight was different. The air in the house was heavier than usual, thick with something unspoken, something waiting. Matt was asleep upstairs, oblivious to the cold fear that gripped her. He hadn't heard the whispers, hadn't seen the shadows creeping beneath the doors, but Sarah had. She had seen the woman every night now, standing at the edge of her vision, her hollow eyes glowing with something like hunger. The attic was calling her. It had been calling her for days. Sarah's hands trembled as she grabbed the ladder and began to climb. The old wood creaked beneath her weight, the sound echoing in the silence of the house. Each step felt like a descent into madness, a final surrender to the voice that had been whispering in her mind, urging her, pulling her toward the attic, toward the darkness. When she reached the top, she hesitated. The space beyond was pitch black, her flashlight only cutting through part of the room, leaving the corners in deep shadow. The smell of damp and decay was stronger now, almost choking, as though the air itself had rotted over the years. But there was no turning back. Not now. Sarah pulled herself up into the attic, her breath fogging in the cold air. She swept the light across the room, revealing the same old, forgotten clutter she had seen before. Broken furniture, trunks full of dust and memories. And then there it was, in the far corner of the attic. The door. The same door they had opened weeks ago, the one leading to the narrow passage. It stood slightly ajar now, a crack of darkness visible between the wood and the wall. The woman was waiting for her. Sarah could feel her. The air buzzed with an unnatural energy, a presence that pressed down on her from all sides. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a step forward, her flashlight trembling in her hands. The whispers began again, low and soft at first, but growing louder as she approached the door. They swirled around her like cold fingers, tugging at her mind, at her will. "Sarah." She froze, the whisper so close it felt like it was inside her skull, echoing in her bones. "Come to me." Her legs moved on their own, taking her closer, each step heavier than the last. She was close now, close to the thing that had haunted her for so long, the thing that had invaded her dreams and shattered her mind. When she reached the door, she hesitated. The darkness beyond it seemed alive, pulsing like a living thing. She wanted to turn back, to run, but something deep inside her knew that there was no escape, not unless she faced it. Sarah pushed the door open. The room beyond was small, almost claustrophobic, and bathed in a faint, sickly light that seemed to come from nowhere. The walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper, and in the center of the room stood an old wooden chair. And in the chair sat the woman. Her skin was pale and waxy, stretched too tightly over her bones. Her dark hair hung in limp strands around her face, and her eyes, deep, sunken pits of shadow, fixed on Sarah with an intensity that made her stomach lurch. The woman smiled. It was the same smile Sarah had seen in her dreams, a crooked, unnatural grin that made her blood run cold. "Who are you?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She just kept smiling, her lips twitching as though she was about to laugh. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand, her fingers curling in a beckoning gesture. Sarah took a step back, her breath hitching in her throat. The air in the room grew colder, the whispers louder. The woman's eyes gleamed with something dark, something that sent a bolt of terror through Sarah's chest. But she couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until she knew the truth. "Why are you here?" Sarah's voice cracked. "What do you want from me?" The woman's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing. For a moment, the whispers stopped, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing in on Sarah from all sides. Then the woman stood. She moved slowly, unfolding from the chair like a marionette, her limbs jerking unnaturally as she rose to her full height. Her gaze never left Sarah's, and as she stepped forward, the air around her seemed to ripple, distorting the space between them. Sarah's legs refused to move. She was frozen in place, her heart pounding in her throat as the woman drew closer, her presence suffocating, overwhelming. When the woman spoke, her voice was a low, raspy hiss, like dry leaves scraping against stone. "You belong to me." The words struck Sarah like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. She staggered back, her mind reeling. "What?" she whispered. But the woman was already moving toward her, faster now, her crooked smile stretching wider, her eyes glowing with a sickly light. Sarah's back hit the wall and she gasped, her hands scrambling for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing. She was trapped. The woman's fingers brushed against Sarah's arm, cold, clammy, and in that moment, everything became clear. This woman, this thing, wasn't a ghost. She wasn't a figment of Sarah's imagination. She was real, flesh and blood, and she had been hiding in the house for years, living in the walls, watching, waiting for someone to take her place. Sarah's eyes widened in horror as the truth hit her like a freight train. The woman wasn't dead, she was alive, and she had been here all along, hiding in the dark corners, slipping through the walls, watching them from the attic. She had been feeding on Sarah's fear, pulling her deeper into her madness, waiting for the moment when Sarah would finally lose control. "No," Sarah gasped, pushing the woman away with all her strength. "No, I'm not yours." The woman stumbled back, her smile faltering, but the glow in her eyes grew brighter, more menacing. She lunged at Sarah, her fingers clawing at her skin, but Sarah was faster this time. She ducked under the woman's grasp and bolted toward the door. The house seemed to come alive around her as she ran, the walls groaning and shifting, the whispers rising to a deafening pitch. The air felt thick, like running through water, but Sarah didn't stop. She couldn't. She reached the attic ladder and slid down it, her hands burning from the speed. The woman's voice followed her, a shrill, inhuman screech that echoed through the house. "You can't leave. You're mine." Sarah's feet hit the hallway floor and she bolted toward the stairs. The shadows in the house seemed to ripple and move, closing in on her from all sides, but she kept running, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Matt was still asleep when she burst into the bedroom, his body sprawled out across the bed, oblivious to the chaos around him. "Matt!" Sarah screamed, grabbing his arm and shaking him. "We have to go, now!" He stirred, groggy and confused, but Sarah didn't wait for him to respond. She yanked him out of bed, dragging him toward the door. As they ran, Sarah could feel the woman's presence behind her, closing in, her footsteps echoing through the house. They burst out the front door into the cold night air, the sharp wind biting at their skin. The house loomed behind them, dark and silent, but Sarah could still feel the woman's eyes on her, watching, waiting. She turned to look at Matt, her heart pounding in her chest. But something was wrong. Matt was smiling, a slow, crooked smile, and in his eyes, Sarah saw the same hollow darkness she had seen in the woman's. The whispers began again, soft and familiar, wrapping around her like a noose. "You can never leave." And in that moment, Sarah realized the truth. She hadn't escaped. She never would. The house had her now, forever.